Hello, and welcome to tonight's Vicki and Carl Zeiger Virtual Insight Seminar for the Sire Project. I'm Lamar Perry, Associate Producer at The Globe, and on behalf of Barry Edelstein, our Erna Fincy-Viterbi Artistic Director, and Tim Shields, our Audrey S. Geisel Managing Director, I'm so glad you can join us tonight to chat with Johanna McKeon and Rowan El Cantor. I'm coming to you from the ancestral home of the Kumeyaay, who have been stewards of these lands for generations. Now, before we get started, I'd like to take a second to recognize the people who made this event possible. A massive thank you to Vicki and Carl Zeiger for their generous support of the Vicki and Carl Zeiger Virtual Insight Seminar. The Globe and I are so grateful to you for making this happen. Now, without further ado, please let me introduce to you our brilliant host for the night, Valeria Vega. Valeria, welcome.
Thank you, Lamar. Hello, everyone. Hola, mucho gusto. I am Valeria Vega, a teaching artist as well at the O Globe. And I'm so happy to do this with this magnificent team, Lamar.
Praise. Well, welcome, Valeria. Listen, it's always a pleasure to have you and good to see you, friend. Now, I think we should welcome our guests. Now, Globe audiences may recognize our director for the Sire Project, Johanna McKeon. Johanna has directed the West Coast premiere of Heather Otho's Noura here at the Globe and was seen in the Old Globe's Power New Voices Festival directing Mona Mansour's Unseen. She is a co-founder of the Susan Sontag Prize for Translation, and she served as a panelist for the Herb Alpert Award in the Arts in 2020. McKeon is the recipient of Drama League, Boris Segal, and Fulbright Fellowships. She received her MFA from the University of Texas at Austin. Please welcome my friend, Johanna McKeon.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, Johanna. How are you?
Hi, I'm very well. I'm in New York City on a sweltering afternoon.
We are coming to you live from San Diego, where it is not sweltering.
Yeah, I bet it's 72 degrees.
It's 74, but you're close. Well, Larry, you want to go ahead and welcome our second guest for the evening?
Of course. Thank you for giving me the honor of introducing our second guest. It's Rowan El Cantor. She is a PhD in Assistant Professor of English in Stanford University. Her book, South Asian Writers, Latin American Literature, and the Rise of Global English is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press and was awarded the ACLA Helen Tarter First Book Subvention Prize in 2021. She is also a translator and the winner of the Susan Sontag Prize for Translation. Please, por favor, démosle la bienvenida a our magnificent Rowan. Welcome.
Rowan,
hi, thanks for having me.
Hello. Well, team, now that you're all assembled and we have the brain trust of the Sire Project put back together, I'm going to leave you in Valeria's very capable hands, and I'll be back at the end of the function. Valeria, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lamar, and thank you both for joining us in this wonderful seminar that we have prepared for everyone. And wonderful that we've got to work on this magnificent project together. So I'm going to start first, Johanna, with you. The Sire Project was conceived as a part of the Globe, what is the Theater Now initiative. Could you share with us all, please, a bit about your cohort and what your mission was with this project?
Yeah, there's so much to say, so I'll try to keep it brief. But about a year ago, I received a call from Justin Waldman, the associate producer at the Old Globe Theater. And he said, listen, the theaters are all shut down. I personally lost every job that I had for the coming year and a half. And it was like, what is theater now? It was an appropriate title.
Yeah.
And so, this was last summer when we talked about this. So I'm in the top of Manhattan, where the coronavirus hit, very viciously. There was a field hospital built around the corner from me, a 5-minute walk from my apartment. And I was just sitting in this apartment for months at that point. And so I said, I'm really interested in Beckett right now. I'm interested in existentialism. I'm interested in the solitary individual and what that person does inside their head when they're just sitting in the same place all day, every day. And so that was on my mind. And what was so great was that Justin said, that's funny because another person who we have tapped for this series is really interested in Beckett and wants to do Krapp's Last Tape. And beautifully enough, that will be the next thing that this series produces. So that was sort of off the table, and Joanna McKeon had just directed this tiny little Beckett piece in the city, and she's one of my heroes. And I just thought, this is in the air. This is the moment. And Justin said, the other thing I think is it should just be something short, because what we're talking about digital theater, we're talking about trying to command people's attentions, and attention span at the time was really flighty. And, the mind was really wandering from one thing to the next. And, there was anxiety and just all sorts of questions in the air. And honest to God, the first thing that popped out of my mouth when he said that was, oh, well, I happen to know about these tiny little stories that someone close to me translated in 2010, I believe, Rowan? Yeah, and the genre is flash fiction because they're so short. And they're also they're existential in nature. They're a solitary experience, these pieces. So they were not plays, but it was really the first thing that popped out of my mouth after Beckett. I was like, oh, what about these stories? And Justin got excited about it, and I got excited about it, and then I called Rowan, and she got excited about it. And so, Rowan can talk a lot more about this, and I'm so happy that she's with us today. It really means a lot to me. But she was the third recipient of the Susan Sontag Prize for Translation in 2009. And this was a prize that when Susan Sontag passed away, her son, David Reef, wanted to create a foundation in her name, and the very first project that the foundation, the first endeavor of the foundation was this prize for translation, because translation was something very near and dear to Susan's heart and career. She had championed many writers from other countries who had not been introduced in America yet, in the United States of America yet. And so the thought was to give a prize, a financial prize, a literary prize, to a translator under the age of 30 who would translate something that had never been translated into English before.
Wow.
And one of the really important things to know about literature and translation in the US is that annually it's under 3% of the books that are published in the United States of America are books in translation. So there's so much more literature out there,
Exactly.
and there are not, and yeah, so it was an admirable project. It was an idealistic project. We wanted to bring young people in. We wanted to bring literature into the canon in English that had not been acknowledged yet.
Yes.
And so Rowan was this feisty, whip smart translator, and she pitched this idea for this book. And this book involved a series of short stories and then some longer stories. When she won the prize, I had put together a literary symposium in Buenos Aires the year after she won the prize. And we got the US Embassy involved in Buenos Aires, and we got some literary institutions in Buenos Aires involved. And we had this beautiful symposium where we introduced Rowan to a lot of the literati there. There were some incredible people. She spoke so eloquently in Spanish on a panel with all of these people that were at least twice as old as her. And she, with the gumption that she has so often professed, she got these stories translated and published.
I love it.
Yeah, so that's when I actually met her in person, was in Argentina.
Wow.
We had a beautiful time. I believe she was all of 23 years old.
23. Oh my God,
I had the biggest
3 years old, and you were already conquering the world. I can't believe this.
It actually gave me a very very inaccurate picture of what it was going to be like to be an academic. I thought it would all be sort of like glamorous conferences where I would be the center of attention. It's really not like that at all. I also had the dubious distinction of being, I think, the only recipient of the prize, at least in the first few years, who cried on the phone when you told me that I won. I was very, very excited and touched. And I continue to be so. I can't believe that this project happened, all those many years ago. And I can't believe that it's come to fruition now. It feels like a complete dream to me. And I'm so excited to come back to this material that I really have always loved.
Most definitely, Rowan. I mean, it's an honor to be in both of your company, really. And for me, reading it the first time in Spanish, that both of you know, it's my first language. I was so involved and submerged in the story that I was like, yes, we are doing this. So thank you both thank you, Johanna, for saying this, and thank you for tying up immediately with Rowan, and Rowan doing the magnificent work that you do to make this possible so we can present this to the world. The world needs to see this, my God, in both English and in Spanish.
And they will.
And they will very soon, coming soon. So to you both, whomever wants to answer first is okay with us. What is the Sire project? If you can explain in detail more, what is it for either of you? Who is it by? If you can let us know as well. What is it about, so we can get like the audience to kind of start loving everything about the story? And if there's anything like historical significance to the piece that you wanna let us all know.
Sure.
Joanne, all you.
I'll start by talking about Juan José Saer, and then we can talk about the project as its own thing. So Sire is a really important kind of post-boom Argentinian writer, one of the most important of the generation after the big generation of Latin American writers from the 1960s that everybody knows, like Julio Cortázar from Argentina, or somebody like Gabriel Garcia Marquez from Colombia, and so on. So after this group of writers kind of launches onto the scene and creates Latin American literature as a world literature, there's actually a lot of dissatisfaction with the way that that particular style of writing is narrowing what can be said and what Latin America is, especially what Argentina is, because Argentina has always had its own significantly separate literary tradition. And so the generation that Sire is a part of is actually trying to like break that open and is reaching to all these other kind of literary traditions in order to talk about what it is to be part of this later generation, what it is to be a sort of citizen of the world. The context of this book, La Mayor, from which these performances are taken, is that it is a book written, I think the first book that Sire published after moving from Argentina to Paris, where he spent the rest of his life and actually taught film. So it's interesting to think that these have been given a new life as scripts and effectively, in a sense, as a sort of visual recorded medium, because that was also an interest of his, although his scripts look quite different. And so this is actually the book that reflects on the moment of leaving. And I think when Sire left, he did not imagine that he would be away for so long, but he wasn't able to return to Argentina until the late 1980s because of what happened immediately around the time of the publication of these stories, which is the opening of what's called the Dirty War in Argentina, the rise of the military junta, the dictatorship, and the massive wave of disappearances of intellectuals and sort of left-leaning politicians, and just basically anybody who got in the way of this this group of people and this sort of administration of power. What's really beautiful about these stories, you see characters sort of flowing in and out. A character will be the main character in one of the stories, will be in the background of another of the stories, and might be sort of the implicit protagonist without having been named in some of the other stories, many of which don't have any characters with names. All of these different people follow Sire throughout his entire career. In this sense, he's a little bit like one of the authors who inspires him, William Faulkner, who writes about the same very small place and the same group of families throughout his career. So this place for Sire is Santa Fe, which is a sort of region outside of the capital of Buenos Aires that doesn't usually get talked about. And in fact, there's such a kind of heavy gravity towards Buenos Aires in Argentinian literature and culture that the whole rest of the country is basically ignored. And so he's part of an important movement also of bringing attention outside of the metropole. This group of characters goes through all of these really important political events as they're happening. We can sort of hear that bubbling under the surface because, of course, it's not as if the Dirty War was the first time that Argentina had trouble with democracy in the 20th century. So we hear those tensions even as they're not yet sort of exploding in what will happen later. And then some of the characters that we come to know and love through these stories ultimately are disappeared by the Dirty War. And so when he returns to Argentina in the late 1980s, he's inspired for what I think of as kind of the other bookend of this book, which is called La Pesquisa, the investigation, which is actually about the disappearance of one of the main characters that was formerly part of his group that he writes about.
Oh my God, Ran, well, thank you so much for this historical background for many of us that kind of live sometimes in our little world and don't understand what's happening all over the world and the situations that as artists, we live even now.
Even today in Afghanistan.
Even today in our present time, 2021. Oh, okay. Next question. What was your, and either or can answer this question, what was the inspiration behind conceiving of this project, of the Sire project? What was the inspiration, Johanna? I mean, you did mention something like what's happening to you personally in the moment of your time that you were living, that this project came to your mind. And obviously, Ryan mentioned something up a little bit, but can we go in depth a little bit more on what was both of your inspiration on this project?
Again, I think Rowan should speak first from the literary slant.
Of course.
Sure. I have to admit that my inspiration was you. You called me up and I thought, oh yeah, well, that's actually really great. I think because these stories, and the first one that is performed in this series that gives it its title, Anonymous Biography, is sort of ideal in this sense. It's exemplary because it's both about a particular person and it's about everybody. And in fact, we had so many conversations when we were deciding about how it should be performed, trying to pin down like who's talking and what they're talking about. And I think that that's an element to the collection at large that makes it really resonant with what we've all been living through. So at the level of theme, we're talking about what it is to toggle between ourselves as little tiny, insignificant individuals, sometimes not even individuals, but actually we're made up of little grains of sands or of moments of time that may or may not be related to one another. Like, do we have a coherent self? That's one of the major questions that this author is trying to work through here and in other pieces. And then at other times we're zooming out and we're trying to conceptualize ourselves as part of a planet or part of a universe or part of a multiverse, indeed. That's really, really hard to imagine. And I think that toggling of scale is actually exactly what we have been experiencing as part of this pandemic, the movement between our own really individual kind of helpless, almost like uniquely isolated in this moment of trying to keep everybody safe, right? Uniquely isolated individualism, and then this attempt at world thinking, which as we can sort of see, doesn't always work that well. Mm-hmm. So that's what sort of resonates for me.
And two things, just to jump off of that, in the story Anonymous Biography, as many people will soon see, the narrator speaks with the word we rather than I. Mm-hmm. The narrator and the actor had so many questions. Our phenomenal actor Ray, yes. Ray had so many questions about why we, why not I. It's not specific enough, and that led to many fascinating conversations about what's actually going on in these stories. Mm-hmm. Which is like, oh, maybe it's like everybody's going through this story, or maybe there's a little bit of like sloughing off of agency when talking about like how this person goes through their daily life. And Rowan used this great word. I don't know if Rowan even remembers, but Rowan used a great word when we were having this conversation about I versus we. And she said, well, you know, it's kind of bro-y. which actually really clicked for me. And I think really clicked for Ray.
Okay.
So there's a degree of separation, there's a degree of irony with which this language can be approached. And that sort of uncorked the possibilities inside of delivery and allowed for humor and allowed for some judgment. You know, there are references to how we sometimes go out past the checkpoint, for instance. And there is not specific reference to people being disappeared at the checkpoint, but as we know, checkpoints have great resonance now. Yes. And these sort of bro-y characters are just like breezing through the checkpoint, not quite noticing the checkpoint, and yet we as the reader or as an audience register it. So we're being asked to think in a slightly different way of like, what is, you know, in a way, how is it that groupthink differs from than a singular identity think? And that was super helpful just in terms of cracking it. Yeah, I mean, I would say the inspiration for me was really, I'm such a huge proponent of organic development of the work that I do. You know, there's one project that there's one play that I've been working on now for 10 years with the same group of people, rehearsing in our kitchens.
Well, for all of you.
We actually just finished a film of it, which is very pandemic appropriate. But I liked very much the fact that it was new. I liked the fact that Rowan and I had this connection. I liked the fact that we brought it into the English language, and that Rowan really did such the lion's share of pushing it out into the world of publication. So I have always had that. I really like to remain loyal to my colleagues and see how they develop, see how those relationships develop over time. And there is more trust when one works that way. So that was part of it as well. But, you know, obviously also, we're talking about a country that is, I mean, sorry to say it, but we're talking about a country that was about to experience, you know, reactionary military takeover. And that was something that was very much on my mind in 2020 when I thought of this project as well.
Yes.
So that was part of it. That was part of it too.
It's part of our nature as artists, right? Present the things as they are. Yeah. In a maybe more stylish, beautiful way, but things as they are. It is what it is, right? That's Talking about a little bit about the translation, Rowan, I want to ask you if you can tell us a little bit more about the background and what is your approach on the translation. What was the approach on the translation was, and what is difficult to maintain, like the art of the meaning of the language from one to another. How do you do this? Like, how does your mind work?
I tell you what, I really envy you all as the working in an art that is not usually recorded, except for in this instance, right? Mm-hmm. I'm sure there are recordings of a lot of performances, but the performance is ephemeral and it goes away. Do you know what is very painful is going back to work that you did a decade ago and seeing all the mistakes that everybody else has been getting. So that's the first thing to say, is that I just, it is really interesting and tough to go back to work and be generous to your former self who did this work. It was so magical for me to get back in the mindset of translation, because it's actually a slightly different mindset than literary scholarship, like what I do now, or teaching. Mm-hmm. It is the same in the sense that our job is to way overthink the meaning of every individual word and all of its possible resonances. And everybody else thinks that we're like really silly and that we're
theater people do that too, Rowan. Theater people do it.
But on the other hand, there's a difference in the sense that as a scholar, I can push my own agenda more. And as the translator, and then coming back to that kind of work, sort of consulting with this project, you actually have to really think about how it is that an author is trying to manifest their priorities in a document that will live beyond them. And that they, in a sense, live beyond. I mean, both things are true, because unfortunately, Juan José Sire passed away in 2005, but also like this came out relatively early in his career. Most of his major work was still to come. So he might have looked back on it and thought like, oh God, I can't believe he was the same as I feel in a certain sense. So there's a special art, I think, to trying to read what are the priorities. That's what I try and do with every sentence. I try and think about what were the biggest priorities in this story, in this collection, and then in this individual sentence. And as much as Johanna is describing this as a book of short stories, each individual sentence goes on forever. And I think it was really interesting also talking about how that would manifest in the performance, because you have this advantage when you're speaking that you can pause. Right? Whereas the sentence sort of just goes on forever. So there is something really intentional in the style where there are really, really long sentences that might last almost an entire page. In certain stories, there are no paragraph breaks. So you're reading page after page after page, just a wall of text. And just bringing that to life is really difficult. Even more difficult is sometimes trying to think about how you put that into another language that has completely different rules and resonances. So sometimes it's thinking about the resonance of a particular word that can be used in multiple different situations. There's one word that's particularly resonant in this collection, stain, mancha, which can actually mean a whole bunch of different things, but is for Sire actually going back to some of the phenomenological literature, some of the philosophy that he's reading that undergirds this text. And so it has to be translated in a certain way so that you see that word and you see its relationship to all of the other instances in which it is appeared. And in other cases, I almost think about his sentences as jokes, not in the sense that they're funny because they're almost never funny, but every once in a while, yes, we had a couple laughs. We discovered some laugh lines in essence, but more in the sense that they have a punchline, they end with a bang. And in order to do this, he does something which is unusual even for Spanish language authors, which is that he really pushes the flexibility of the syntax right to the limit. And so if you read some of those sentences as they're translated in English, when I'm trying to reproduce some of that flexibility, you might just think that like, I'm not a very good translator, or I don't write in English very well, or who knows what you might think. But in fact, like there's a real kind of point to delivering the sentence in that way. And there's so much weight that comes in at the beginning of the sentence and then very much so at the end. Even in what's not a joke, we always kind of try and put the emphasis towards the end of a sentence. It directs the way that the actor is going to use their voice in order to indicate where the breaks are between different ideas. And so it brought me back to a lot of the really hard decisions that I made and agonized over and potentially made wrong in the process of originally translating this piece.
Thank you, Rowan, for that. And talking about creating this and bringing it to life, Johanna, I need to ask you to tell us a little bit more about the process of creating the actual tapes. I know a little bit, but let us all know a little bit about
very much there.
Creating the tapes and what accommodations had to be made to create theater during this time, during this pandemic, and what felt for you the same and or what felt different of this process.
Yeah. Well, it's like a new genre has just sprouted in the last 18 months of theater, honestly, because everybody's been hit with it, you know. I had directed, before we did this, I had directed a group of students at NYU in a Dario Fo play called Mr. Obufo, which I had selected because I could rehearse it specifically as monologues, and I could just rehearse with one person at a time, and that person would be looking into the camera. Because I really had a problem with people saying, yeah, it's just a regular play, we're all just in Zoom boxes and we're all connecting. Like, I just didn't buy it. And I'm sure that some people have done this very successfully, and I know that Zoom has actually been incredibly helpful in terms of the democratization of new play readings. And that's been very exciting, and there are all sorts of possibilities with the form. But for me, I felt like I need to stay honest with myself about the fact that this piece of theater is probably going to be consumed on a phone. Somebody's going to be staring at their phone, scrolling through, and my little 7-minute play is going to come up. And when that happened, I wanted that person to be looking directly at the person on their phone. Like, that's what I thought, that's what I wanted. That's what I was going for.
Mhm.
So, you know, we did all of it virtually. So Rey, when we had our first meeting with our fabulous leading man, he announced that he had never been on a Zoom before. It was his first Zoom ever of the pandemic, which was so amazing.
I did not know that.
So in a way, you know, it was like, it was very fresh terrain for him, and he brought all of his vulnerability to it.
Wow.
But yeah, it's fascinating, right? What everybody's in a pandemic, you know. His wife had just given birth, I believe 5 months before we shot this project. So anyway, he had a camera. We sent him a backdrop. Our fabulous DP, Joshua Peters, talked him through how to set up the lights and the backdrop and the camera. Rey did it himself. And I know the New York Times ran a story, maybe, I don't know, about a year ago, maybe 9 months ago, about other actors setting up their own technical situations for virtual theater. And there's a whole narrative there. But, you know, Rey went through it as well. And luckily, I guess he had played a lot of video games. So he had some dexterity with the tech. He also did a lot of self-taping for his film and television career. So, you know, Rey, we're like talking through Zoom. Rey sets up his own thing, you know, with the help of a DP on Zoom. Then we all got together with Rowan, with you, Valeria, because Valeria was entirely the Spanish language consultant on the entire project, and did a fabulous job. And it was so, and for anybody who doesn't know, Valeria is in Mexico City. Oh, no, Valeria's in Tijuana.
Well, it's Mexico.
Yes, so Valeria's in Mexico. I was in New York. Rey was in Connecticut. Josh was in New York and then LA. Rowan was down near Stanford. So it was like all really scattered. We all came together. We talked about the material, and then Rey realized that the sound from the traffic outside of his house was prohibitive of us shooting during scheduled rehearsal hours. So we basically rehearsed and discussed the material and read the material together. And then Rey, in the middle of the night, taped himself.
2 something in the morning, right? 2 or 3 in the morning.
2 or 3 in the morning, because Rey has a baby. So Rey is up in the middle of the night. So yeah, I mean, it was a very unconventional process.
Somehow that also feels very apt to a lot of the stories are like, something woke me up at 2 in the morning, and now I have to like think about life and death and the self.
That's true.
So
that's true.
It's very true.
He was living the story, right? He was actually living the story.
And he really brought it. And I mean, it was Herculean. I mean, it was just a massive push for him to do this. And he pulled all-nighters, and he did 5 stories in 2 different languages by himself in the middle of the night after, you know, discussing it at length with us. So it was a fascinating process.
Yeah, bravo to Rey from everywhere.
And then there was, you know, the process of post, which you know, we're done with now and getting ready to release. The really good news in terms of the way that the things are framed is that I knew I just wanted a face talking out of your phone or out of your laptop to a single person in their, you know, with like their headphones on, sitting on a subway or sitting in an apartment by themselves. But I knew that it was going to be solitary consumption also. So we just sort of have his head floating in the dark. And that ended up being the most powerful expression of the stories. And the process of post-production was me just carving away anything but that. And it turned out it was just as usual in the theater. It was about the spoken word. It was about the power of the spoken word and an actor who was capable of having this language resonate in him, which, you know, Rey obviously does admirably.
Yes. And I love it how you kind of touched in and dived into my next question, telling us a little bit your perspective of how you envision people seeing this work, right? You had mentioned that you have your vision, and ideally, like, imagine people like on their phone or wherever they're at, on their tablet or whatever device they have to view things, right? You mentioned that, but what is, like, when we're viewing it as audience, is there like in a specific order that we should watch, like all of the stories, or what do you hope like the whole viewing experience is like?
Yeah, I hope that it happens with a little gap in between each, you know, with a day or a week in between each.
Okay.
I like it as just like it's like swallow this philosophical nugget. And I mean, that's something really important that Rowan touched on. But, you know, this writer, who is of Lebanese Syrian descent. His parents were Lebanese Syrian immigrants in Argentina. He grew up in Argentina, speaking Spanish, speaking Argentine Spanish, is reading Argentine literature, is thinking about this river that goes through Santa Fe every day, is musing on that. And then is also, he has shifted himself to Paris, where he's surrounded by philosophers. So he's doing like the deep dive into the big thoughts. So it's not exactly, you know, it's not exactly binge watching, you know, White Lotus.
I would also say there is a, you know, thinking again about how we read the text for its own priorities. The end of this collection is a short story. It's not included in the performance, but it's called Carta la Vidente, letter to the Cirrus in this case. And it's about somebody who's writing to the position of the Cirrus, who, like, literally somebody who is all seeing in this case, right? From the position of what he calls the nearsighted guy, the person who is myopic, right? So I think that that's a really interesting perspective, especially when we think about our phones actually as being the Cirrus, as being something that can notionally see everything, right? Yes. If you could see everything and you have this one person who's just trying to kind of feel, I don't know if you all are nearsighted. I'm tremendously nearsighted. I happen to be wearing contacts right now. If I'm not wearing my contacts, exactly, yes, I can see about this far in front of my face. So actually that's such a beautiful metaphor for like trying to figure out what life is actually we have such a limited perspective, but we're just trying to feel it out, just trying to push it a little back, move forward cautiously, kind of expand our awareness. And each one of these stories, in a sense, is about the process of pushing against those boundaries with really limited tools. And I think that there's something really beautiful about situating that conversation that was once on the page between the reader as notionally all-seeing and the writer as very limited, and resituating it in this technology that might give us incredible insight, but usually doesn't.
What a beautiful reflection, Ryan. Thank you.
I'll also say, I described it this way to somebody last month. I said, you know, I think the thing about this project, for me, there is a certain part of our brain that we use when we're just staring at our phone for hours at a time. And it's kind of hard to put your finger on what that part of your brain is. You know, we're scrolling through factoids, you know, this political thing, this cute kitten, like this. There are like so many different things happening, but like what's real, like what part of our brain is that? And I was actually really fascinated in like trying to tap into it a little bit with this project. And I find the stories to be so focused and hypnotic, and I find Ray's attack of the language to be so focused and hypnotic that I'm hoping that that part of the brain gets a little sizzled while they're experiencing the stories. And I think, yeah, I mean, again, it's great that they're short, because that is that's the kind of concentration that we're capable of when we're scrolling through the internet.
Of course, they're short stories. We have them in English, we have them in Spanish, all of them. But do you believe that there's an order, like an actual order that we should like watch them? Like, should we watch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 5, 2, 1, 3, or what is?
I think, can I make the diplomatic answer here and say, I think that the Old Globe Theater is going to determine which one is released first, which one is released second. And I very much look forward, I'm sure I'll be part of that conversation, but I've always sort of thought that Anonymous Biography would come first.
Mm-hmm.
We have yet to confirm that, but it's an appropriate way to begin.
Mm.
And I think that, and honestly, since you're asking, I would say that memories would be a good way to end. Because it's a sort of, what is that? A manifesto of sorts. It's a manifesto about a new sort of narrative, about a narrative not having a beginning, a middle, and an end, but a narrative being composed of isolated and specific memories that your mind is just wandering through.
I agree, most definitely. And I have a question for you, Hermosa Rowan. What signals to you that a translation has been successful? Is there such a thing of a perfect translation?
I'm supposed to say no, there's no such thing as a perfect translation because, according to the specialists in our field, a translation always sort of resists its completion.
Mm-hmm.
But I was trained by a really, really, really accomplished, wonderful translator named Michael Henry Heim, who also has since passed away and now actually has his own translation fellowship. So slowly we're pushing against that 3% number. And his attitude was that if you read what's called the target language, or if you hear the language in which the translation has been produced, you can judge it as its own text in that language. Does it succeed as a text in that language? And other people would ask, like, does it use the language from which it's been translated to push against the boundaries of what we think of as typical and appropriate and interesting in the target language? So I guess, and again, I feel so unqualified to say, but I guess that a successful translation would be one that both kind of resonates where the language is interesting, but also kind of falls away so that we can be captured by the meaning and the performance. But then also one that kind of, just as the stories themselves do, push against our everyday expectations and maybe broadens our world just a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you. And lastly, you two, I love this conversation. I would wish to that last for a longer time. But lastly, please let us all know what makes this project relevant today, and specifically in this backdrop that we had of a pandemic. And Johanna, what do you hope people walk away from, like, with this project?
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken a lot about the relevance just in terms of the politics of it, in terms of questions of identity. There are a lot of questions about, there are blatant statements about the breaking up of the identity barrier in these stories, which I find to be wildly important. I find internationalism to be wildly important right now at a time of increasing nationalism. I think that understanding other cultures and other people is like the best thing going. So yes. I think that that's wildly relevant. And I hope that it just, I mean, it's like Rowan was just saying something really interesting about pushing the mental experience into a slightly new place and leaving people's thoughts slightly altered or way of thinking slightly altered, maybe just for those, 6 or 7 minutes. But they have certainly made, these stories have given me pause, for sure. I think about rivers much more deeply now. And I mean, as you will see, that's just something that comes up again and again. And it was Rowan who said, I think in the second day of rehearsal, and she sort of threw it off like a cliche, but you never step in the same river twice.
Yes.
That's one of the great lessons of this fiction, And it's something that he came to very palpably and specifically because he was staring at a river when he was in Santa Fe. I also think it's extraordinarily interesting to think about the fact that he was writing about this one place in Argentina for pretty much his whole career from a different country. So he was remembering it. And that's something that is super interesting to consider. Like he was obviously very interested in Proust, and he was trying to sort of mock some of the formal stylistic things that Proust was messing with in terms of memory. But I think it's going back to the subject of existentialism. I think that we have all been sitting with ourselves in a new way for these last 18 months. I mean, I know I have, but I'm sure everybody, I mean, the more that I talk to other people, it sounds like everybody is. Yeah, I mean, just giving people pause to think about like who they are, like we're just these little creatures wandering around this planet. And I think that's important to remember sometimes, because we're living in a time of such rampant narcissism. It's good to like expound upon that idea and try to like reach out of it and look at the limits of that.
Thank you for that beautiful response and this brilliant conversation with you both. Before we wrap it up, unfortunately, I need to ask you, is there any of you want to comment or mention or add anything to this whole conversation that you think it's important that everybody else knows? Do you know if we missed something or anything that you want to add?
Rowan, I'll just say this. I'll just say, because Rowan pitched these stories and we went to Buenos Aires, I gained such a profound love of that city and a profound love of the Argentine culture. And I truly hope that people get curious about this wildly literary culture. And you know, we went and saw people doing the tango one night at like 1 o'clock in the morning with this amazing filmmaker Edgardo Kozarinsky, who was one of our hosts when we were there. And he showed us like the heart of the city. And I just hope, I know that this is a stretch, but I'll just say it. I just hope that we all go travel all over the world and that everybody tries to engage in the heart of other cultures. You know, that's like what it's like a standard Miss America thing, right? Like, I just want world peace.
I do actually want to second that. I also want to say that my experience of having been sort of captivated by this author is actually really common. I would say the most common experience, it's perfectly fine if you see these stories and they just don't do it for you. It's not your thing. I hope that you think about them. I think that they're really beautiful. It may be that they don't touch your heart even as they touch your mind. There are a few people, though, for whom Sire is an experience of conversion. That's what it was for me. I think in a certain sense, Johanna, for you and the rest of the people at the foundation, that was also the experience for you. And then since that time, I've actually met other people. In fact, I had a student once who was past my translation when it finally came out in 2015 to do a review of it. And he was so obsessed by this author that he ended up writing his master's or his undergraduate thesis on this author, like 100 pages of all of his work. And that's what happens. And so if you feel it happening to you, it's a wonderful club to join. It's a very specific type of club. But Juan José Saer tends to make very zealous converts. And if it touches your heart, it really takes you all the way. And I have had such an incredible, I have gone on such an incredible journey by letting myself be swept up by this author and this book. And I am so grateful for all the places, including this one, that it has taken me.
Yes, well, thank you, Ran, for introducing us to Juan José Saer, which has been for me personally, and I think all a magnificent experience. And welcome back, Lamar.
Hello, I'm back, friends. First, thank you, Rowan, Johanna, Valeria, for this beautiful conversation. I can't wait for folks to be able to experience the entire Sire project. It's been such a joy working on it over the course of the last few months. So thank you so much for being here with us today. Friends at home, thank you for listening and thank you for sharing this event with us. Anonymous Biography is generously sponsored in part by Bank of America. Virtual programs at the Old Globe are supported in part by the Conrad Prebys Foundation. Financial support is provided by the City of San Diego. The Theodore and Audrey Geisel Fund provides leadership support for the Old Globe's year-round activities. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for more information on our next What is Theater Now project, Krapp's Last Tape by Samuel Beckett, directed by San Diego favorite Patricia McGregor, featuring the talents of two-time Emmy Award-winning actor Ron C. Fish Jones. Good night, everybody.